Hello and welcome to another book review. This week I will be reviewing this book, The Secret History by Donna Tartt. It's the first book I've ever read of hers. I didn't know very much about the author before I read the book. A little bit of research. This is apparently her first novel. It is probably her second most well-known novel. There's another book that she wrote called The Goldfinch, which I don't know very much about, but it is much more well-known. I think it's being developed into a television show or a movie. Another interesting point I learned about her was that her book, The Secret History, is dedicated to Bret Easton Ellis, the author of American Psycho, as well as another work, I believe it's Rules of Attraction, which was developed into a movie in the early 2000s, which has actually a similar premise to this, not necessarily a similar premise, but a similar setting as this book, The Secret History, and I absolutely hated that movie. I've never read the book that the movie is based on, but apparently they were, at one point, a couple. It's interesting that they both wrote books in a similar setting, wildly different in tone, but I found that was interesting, and I would wonder, if I was to ask Donna Tartt a question, if his writing influenced her at all, because I think that book was written in the mid-'80s, and it's in a similar setting to this book, even though the wildly different tone, wildly different premise, but I found that they both have written books about life in a college bubble interesting. Quick synopsis of the book. I'll go over what the plot is without spoiling it, then I'll go into some things that I liked about it. I'll touch on a little bit of what I did not like for it, and what I didn't like about the book. Then I'll kind of finish up by giving recommendations to people who may or may not want to read this. Basic summary of the plot is there's a 20-year-old college student named Richard Pepin who is from a working class family in California. He is in a local college for about 2 years. He excels at Greek and decides one day to transfer colleges after receiving a brochure for a selective college in Vermont. So he transfers over to the school there, and he joins a Greek course taught by a mysterious, I guess is a way to put it, professor who only teaches a very small number of students at any one time, and they all learn exclusively from him. So he's the only teacher at the college for the most part. For people, his tutelage under him. So not to give too much away, Richard soon becomes involved in a conspiracy of sorts among the Greek students there, and the book kind of follows the aftermath of the conspiracy he becomes involved with, and has something of a tragic ending. Again, I won't spoil it. Overall, I really, really enjoyed the book. I was impressed it was the first novel that she had wrote, Donna Tartt has written. I thought the pacing of the novel was really strong. I think it is a page-turner of a book. I read it in a couple of days. Between reading the book and also listening to the audiobook, I plowed right through it. The language is really interesting, and there are really some beautiful passages. It also does a good job of kind of reminding you who these characters are through the use of the language. So there's a lot of references to Greek literature, Greek trains of thought, specific words and phrases that are only translated in Greek, that don't have an English translation, and kind of a rough understanding of what that would be. So it really makes you see the events of the novel through the eyes of the characters who are involved in it. I thought that was really good. The characters are all really well developed. For the most part, the main characters are really well developed. You basically follow Richard and these students and their teacher, and a couple other minor characters, but mostly it's the 5 or so students, the Greek students, as these events unfold in this kind of upper middle class or wealthy to do private Vermont college students. And that's really one of the main things about the book, is that it's really examining life in this bubble at this college. And I thought that was captured really well. If you've ever been inside of a situation where you're kind of roped off from the rest of the world in a kind of small environment where you kind of know everybody where you are, I thought the book did a really, really strong job of capturing that. Like I said, I think the characters were well developed. I think the way that the book is paced is really strong. It doesn't really sag too much. There's a part from probably 70% of the novel to maybe 90% of the novel done that's a little saggy, but otherwise I thought it did a really good job of strong pacing, really makes you kind of propel through it. The characters are, like I said, interesting and distinctive for the most part. And it was really interesting. I think I guess if you want to call it a mystery, the mystery of the main plot really propels you through it. Some things I guess I didn't like about it, and most of these things I would say are fairly nitpicky. I'll maybe start at some of the more nitpicky things and getting to kind of maybe the stronger issues I had overall with the book. I think, and I know this is kind of strange, but the the setting of the book in terms of geography is very clear. In terms of the time where the book takes place, is a little unclear until about halfway through the book. I know that's kind of silly to some people. That's really not a huge criticism. And it's not a huge criticism, but when you're trying to place and understand whereabouts the era that the characters are, it was sometimes disorienting because some of the characters speak like you would think that, again, kind of upper crust people would speak back in the 50s. So you would hear male characters refer to each other as old boy or my dear boy, things like that. And you're like, is this in the 40s? And so then you realize there's references to the 1970s and there's references to rap music that I think the novel never explicitly says it, but I believe the novel took place when the book was written, or you're expected to understand that the novel takes place at the time the book was published, which was around 1992. And again, it's not a huge deal, but when I'm reading something and it's supposed to take place in the quote-unquote real world, I kind of want to know what the time frame is. And some people that may not matter, but there's like several references to the Grateful Dead, and so when you're reading it, you're like, there's a little bit of orientation as far as that goes about when the novel took place. Not a huge deal, but that was something that was kind of bothersome. From kind of a plot literature standpoint, this is a novel that I find when I read certain novels that are more of a literary bent, that the plot is kind of secondary to the writing. And again, I think the writing of this novel is really strong, and I think it does get away with this for the most part. But the plot has, I would say, two separate, what I would call inciting incidents, which is to say, the parts of the plot that really propel the plot forward and kind of where the action kind of takes off from, and where the action kind of starting points for the action, inciting incident. So the first one of these two, and there's, like I said, there's two of them. The first one that kind of brings Richard into the plot is actually kind of silly, and it's not necessarily well followed throughout the rest of the book. And I didn't necessarily buy it, I guess. You kind of have to, in some ways, you can kind of put it aside and say, well, this is silly. But the second incident, the second kind of major incident of the novel, is actually really cool and really interesting and changes basically all the characters. That one was, I think, great and made tons of sense and is done in a really, really well. I probably should mention that at the end when I kind of get into my recommendations. That part of it is done great, and it made a lot of sense, and all the characters kind of act in a realistic manner. But the first inciting incident, as it were, of the plot is kind of silly, and I think that if she had done something else other than that, I think it would have been a stronger novel. Like I said, the kind of the reasoning for it and maybe the outcome of it don't necessarily flow through the novel as well as the second one, which has kind of a longer lasting effect. The other thing is there's one major character in the novel who, in the beginning of the novel when you're reading it, they seem to, it seems to be saying, the novel seems to be saying that this character is going to be a major player in the book, and they kind of hint at his background and it being kind of significant. And as you read the book, you're kind of waiting for them to come back in, waiting for them to come back in, and they kind of never do. And that character is a little bit of a frustration. It seems to be kind of a hanging thread over the novel. And they have kind of an ending, sort of, but it really, again, doesn't make a ton of sense. And then there's another character who reminded me a little bit of Ramona Flowers, in the sense that there are many characters, mostly male characters, who are kind of pining after this character. And other than the author saying that she's an attractive girl, there's really no reason for them to be doing it. When you're reading it, you're like, I don't quite get the attraction here, because you've noted there are other attractive female characters at this school, and they don't seem to be after them as much, but there's this one girl, and she's just got it, whatever it is, and you're just kind of scratching your head a little bit there. The other thing, and I think that's for the most part the issues I had with it. I think, again, overall, it's an interesting book. I think the other thing that I forgot to mention as far as a negative, the ending doesn't quite land. It's supposed to have something of a tragic ending, and because of what I said earlier about one of the two characters, it's not quite tragic. It's not quite tragic. Part of that, too, is the characters are still relatively young at the time of the ending of the novel, so that it's supposed to have this weight of their decisions, and it doesn't quite, for me at least, didn't quite land is super tragic. So that being said, overall, like I said, I did enjoy the book. I do plan on reading more from her in the future. The plot, like I said, wasn't the most original thing in the world, and I think that can be forgiven, but the writing carries it through. And so if I was to recommend this, who would I recommend it to? I think I would recommend it to anybody who likes true crime stuff, because the kind of the cabal and the kind of conspiracy in this novel, I believed all the characters would act the way that they did. Given the characters' station in life, I guess is a way to say it, given kind of the resources they have available to them, they all act in a very realistic manner, in my opinion. So if you're someone who likes something like, let's say, the Serial podcast, the first season of Serial, I think you'd actually really enjoy this book, because it has that kind of similar vibe to it. I don't think any of the characters act crazy. It's not like there's supervillains or anything in the novel. They all act relatively realistic. If you're someone who likes a good literary novel, I think this is a good place to go to. It's not super long, but it does have enough heft to it that you'll enjoy it. Like I said, there's not too much sag in it. There's a couple parts that I would probably have edited out, but overall I thought it was well done. The people who should not read this, are people who are in college now. Like I said, this was published in 1992, and if you're someone who does not necessarily come from means, you may not be able to relate to these people as college students, because 90% of the time they're drinking, they have money, they don't really care that much about their studies, it's not really clear what they're going to do with the degrees that they are receiving. So in a way, it's kind of anachronistic for a lot of people, I think, to read this. It's a little bit like asking high school students in some way to understand The Great Gatsby. There's a certain amount of separation that you're really never going to enter that world. I think this was a little bit more realistic if you were someone in maybe the late 80s and you were going to college, and there was kind of a separation and understanding, like these 4 years of your life, you're going to experience things and party a little bit, and it's really not going to be a huge strike against you. I think that the world has changed a little bit, and so that may not be something that you see as realistic, and it may be something that honestly is going to frustrate you if you're someone who's working 2 or 3 jobs to get through college. But if you can separate yourself from that, I do think it's an interesting book. I do think it's well done. I'd be interested to see what else she does in a different setting with different characters. So overall, I do recommend this book, Donna Tartt's The Secret History. I look forward to reviewing books for you guys next time. So see you again here at another book review. Please feel free to like and subscribe to the channel if you've enjoyed this. Thank you.